Hello, this is Euan. Hello again. Today we're going to be introducing how to configure a certificate SVG in OpenCRVS. So this video is a technical configuration video following on from a video which my colleague John has produced based on the design process in Figma to create your certificate design. So some of the things I talk about, John may already have spoken about, but just to carry on from the point at which the design is ready in Figma and you're ready to export that as a SVG file. So I'm sure John will mention many things about how best to export the file, but one point we really need to make is that when you are exporting the SVG, you select SVG and there's these three dots, export settings. You have to make sure that outline text is deselected. That's very important. So make sure the outline text is deselected and then you can export the SVG. So when the SVG exports, if you open it up in Chrome, for example, you can see it looks a bit like this. So obviously the fonts are not coming through. So when we look at the SVG as a PNG file, we're expecting something to look a bit like that. So we can see the fonts are all nicely rendered. So the first task in configuring SVG files is to configure fonts. The second thing that we need to do is, if you look at all of the data in the SVG, such as the name, the sex, date of birth, etc., we want to replace this with dynamic values from the actual registration. So here we can see the designer has chosen the location for that data. We need to substitute it for the real data. And we do that using handlebars. So you may be familiar with handlebars templating language. Here you can see we have HTML and handlebars with a variable first name and last name. These will substitute in the certificate with the actual values. So we'll be discussing how do we understand what the variable names are for each data point. The third thing we'll be doing is, you may notice that there are some dynamic handlebars where, for example, place of birth, we need to show different information depending if the place of birth was in a hospital or if it was at an address. And this is because in the forms, when you select place of birth hospital, we dynamically pull in the district and state and the country from the health facility data that we prepared in CSV files in earlier videos. We don't show the full address for a hospital. We just show the districts, the states, the administrative structure generally. And in general, we don't really want to show full addresses in a certificate because for parents, this is personally identifiable information, which you probably should think twice about putting on a paper certificate that can be lost. But of course, it may be that your regulations require you to put in a full address for an individual, and that's fine. We have all the handlebars to do that. So I'll be talking about how to do dynamic handlebars for different address structures. So for example, you may also have a parent who resides in a foreign country. So you need to kind of have if-else conditionals in your address structure. If they're born in your country, then, if they live in your country, then you can get the address structure from your administrative structure data that you've seeded in the CSV files. But if they live in a foreign country, then you're going to be showing different address lines. So that sort of handlebar needs to be dynamically constructed. And the fourth and final thing we'll be talking about with certificates is how do you substitute images for the real image. So the designer has used a QR code here image just to block out where the registrar's signature should be rendered. So this will be a signature PNG coming from OpenCRVS. So there's a signature handlebar, depending on who the registrar is. And likewise, this is actually a QR code, which also needs to be dynamically generated to allow you to verify the certificate with a QR scanner camera. So this is another image which needs to be substituted. So those are the four things we're going to be introducing. So the first point is around fonts. So first of all, you need to ask the designer for TTF files for every font weight and font family that they are including in the certificate. Now you can find that out for yourself if you open the SVG in your code editor. So where do you put the SVG files? Well, you will find the location for the SVG files in your country config repository, in the source folder, in the data seeding folder, certificates, source. So if you look in that location, you will see our default birth, death, marriage certificates that we created for our fake country for Rajaland. And these will be the ones that you will have in your database at the moment. So the setup script will have already seeded these into your database, so they will be existing. So when you get your new birth certificates, you can just drag them into this folder and open them up and take a look at the code. And you can see in the code HTML. You can see the font families that are in use, and you can see the font weights that are in use. So you need to get a TTF file for every font weight for your font family. And then you need to place them into a folder. So the location for the font files, because they're used in the client application, is source API fonts. And you will see you can add a new font file in there. So you can add as many fonts as you want, but of course, the more fonts that you add, it increases the size of the OpenCRVS application. So we recommend keeping the number of fonts used in your certificate low. Perhaps use the same font with just different weights, but of course it's up to you. But don't use too many fonts. Now for every font file that you add, you have to configure the certificate configuration endpoint to point to your fonts. So you'll see a file called handler in the certificate configuration folder, a few steps up inside the source API folder. And you can see that I have set up my font family Noto Sans, and there are two font weights in use. These are normal, which is set to the regular font, and bold, which is set to the bold TTF file font. You can also include 2 more font weights in a certificate. You can choose italics and bold italics. So we use Notasan's semi-bold in some parts of OpenCRVS, but I'm afraid you cannot use semi-bold weight in a certificate. You can only use normal, bold italics or bold italics. And this is simply because this is the library that we use to generate PDFs from JavaScript. It's called PDF make, and it's a limitation of the JavaScript library that these are the font weights we can choose from. We cannot, it's hard coded. You cannot add semi-bold or any other font weight. So if you want to use another font weight, or then you can use any weight you like, but it must point to the correct variable. So say, for example, you had to use a semi-bold, or you had to use some other font weight. You could point to the TTF file and use the variable italics, for example, and reuse italics for semi-bold. What you'd have to do is in your certificates is you'd have to update the font weight that you wanted to use that new weight, and use font weight equals italics, even if you're not actually italicizing the text, because those are the only four variables you can choose from. So my certificate is in place, and I can start up OpenCRVS and see what it looks like, and move on to the next step, which is to configure handlebars. But first of all, let's just check what the fonts look like. So I have OpenCRVS running, and I have created a few registrations, because you have to register in order to print. So just create a few fake registrations in your local environment and get them ready to print. You need to log out and log in as a system administrator. So the default system administrator is J Campbell, password is test, and some 6-digit zeros for two-factor authentication code. Login is Jonathan Campbell, the system administrator, and you will see the system administrator view. Click on configuration, click on certificates, and the 3 dots on the right hand side, you can upload your new certificate file. So let me just find that file and upload it. So it's source, data seeding, certificates, source, and I'm going to upload this certificate that I'm working on and click apply. So now I have my new certificate uploaded. I have saved everything, and I can now log in as a registrar and take a look at the certificate. So I'm just going to search the name of the registration. Here we are, and go to print. And if you select, well, it doesn't really matter which one you want to choose. Just continue all the way through that. and you should see the certificate render. And you can see the fonts look fine, so they're loading in correctly. If you want to, you can actually go ahead and print that certificate and see what it looks like in a PDF, make sure the fonts look okay in the PDF. And that's how you configure fonts in the certificate. So when eventually you are happy with your certificates, you will want to make sure that the next time you clear the database and seed it, it picks up your new certificates automatically, so you don't have to keep logging in as a system administrator and uploading them every time in testing. In future testing, you'll need to keep doing that as you iterate on your certificate by adding handlebars, but at the end of the process you want to make sure that the next time it seeds, everyone's going to get the latest certificate. So because when the database clears, it's going to clear out all the certificates. So when the seeding happens on another developer's machine, you want to make sure that they get your latest one that you've committed to Git. So in order to make sure that's going to happen, take a look in the data seeding folder. You'll see a file called handler.ts, and you'll see that currently the handler is pointing to our default certificate SVG files. So you need to update the file name and this SVG code source URL to your new certificates. So I'm just going to do that now for all 3 certificates. So copying the name of that file and replacing all the file names here. This will be Fraudulent birth certificate, fraudulent death certificate, fraudulent marriage certificate. And just so that I know when I'm looking through the UI which version I'm currently on, update the file name properly too, like so. That's saved. So now going forward, these default certificates that we provide you, you don't need them anymore. You can delete them. Okay, so our fonts are ready. The next thing we want to do is be able to substitute this information with the actual information from the registration itself. So that is where we need to start using handlebars. So I think you may have seen that this registration, the child is called Phil Foden, and yet we see here the Jonathan Smith, which is the information that the designer was using just as test information. So we need to find and replace the use of Jonathan Michael Smith in the birth certificate with the handlebar for the child's first name and last name, middle name, last name. And we need to do that for every single piece of dynamic data. So how do you know what the variables are for each of these? Well, there are two approaches you can use. The first is, if you scroll down and look at the form folder, so this is in data seeding, well, outside of data seeding, apologies, you'll see source, form, and then you'll see inside the form folder, folders for every single event. And we'll talk about these folders when we do a video about form configuration. But you'll see in the birth folder, there's a file called certificate handlebars. And in this file, you can see these are all the certificate handlebars you can use by default when configuring a form or configuring APIs. So they're not really in any kind of order, but you can see we've got a variable for child's first name, family name, gender. So the first name actually contains all subsequent names, middle names. So it's actually first names. So that's your first name and any other given names, middle names, etc. Family name is the surname. So we can use these two handlebars and substitute that location in the certificate. So this is one thing we can do. We can go to Jonathan Michael Smith, we can delete that, and we can use handlebar syntax, child's first name, space, child family name. Child family name. And that's us entered the handlebars for that piece of data. So you can refer back to this and you can go through all of the other handlebars that you need, including things like registrar's name. You've got some objects. You've got registrar.name you can use, registrar.signature, things like this. We've got every possible form question that comes with default, comes by default. And we'll talk about form configuration in a different video, but if you've created custom form questions, you'll find out how to get a custom handlebar should you need to add in some extra data that's not included by default. And there are some properties which come through from APIs, like if you're integrating with MOSIP, you've got like MOSIP application ID. If you've configured more unique identifiers to be generated for a child at the point of registration, you've got handlebars for them in case you need to show them the certificate. But in general, you'll be using what comes in the form. So those files exist in the birth folder and the death folder. You can see all the properties, handlebars for death and marriage folder. But there is another thing you can do, because sometimes this file may not be exhaustively kept up to date. We do our best to add handlebars in here whenever we create new functionality, but sometimes we could miss that, and please open the pull request if you find one which is missing. But if you want to see every single handlebar that's available to you on this registration, there's another neat trick you can do. So sometimes you might want to format the data in a different way, such as, for example, dates. You might want to format them in a different way. So we allow you to customize how the handlebar data will render using handlebar helpers. So handlebar helpers are a built-in component of handlebars.js. So for example, here you can see a handlebar helper called loud, and it could be that in this case, when they use the handlebar helper loud, you can make a string render all in uppercase, for example. You can do whatever you want. You can create any kind of helper you like, for example, to wrap text over multiple lines. The restriction is that you have to write them in CommonJS. You cannot use another library. You cannot make an API fetch request in a helper. It's just CommonJS. That's all you have. So it's really more about text rendering than actual anything more dynamic than that. So if you want to use a library to say formatted data in a different way, you're going to have to do that in CommonJS. You have to find out the code and do it yourself. You can't rely on another library. So anyway, back to the subject. You can write a specific helper which will render all of the possible certificate handlebars that you can use. So let me show you how to do that. So you will find a folder inside the form directory called Common. And inside the Common folder, you can see a folder called Certificate Handlebars Helpers. This is where you can write any kind of helper you like. So this will take in whatever handlebar you pass to it, perform an operation on it, and return back whatever you want. So here's an example where I've actually created a handlebar helper called debug. And I'll just zoom into the code here so that you can copy it. So you can see that what this is going to do is take in any of the handlebars and log them to the console. So it'll take in all the handlebars available to you in the registration and log them into the console. In order to make this debug helper work, go back to your certificate and somewhere in your certificate within the content you can add that handlebar in, like so. Here you can see I've added in a debug handlebar, and then when the certificate renders, when you're previewing it, if you inspect the console, you will find an object containing all the handlebars next to the value of them. So this is a really neat tool you can use to very quickly simply copy over that variable name and place it in your certificate wherever you need it to be. So this is a really useful function to help you configure your certificate handlebars really quickly. So I'm going to take some time to complete all of the static handlebars in my certificate and then show you the result. And we can rejoin this video with the next step, which will be using dynamic functions for handlebars. Thank you. Back soon. Hello everyone. So I have finished adding in all the handlebars for the dynamic data. So if you can see on my screen, I'll just zoom in. You can see I've now managed to get all of the actual data rendering in the certificate from the actual registration data. So this next step for me is to take a look at some dynamic handlebars. So I'm just going to come out of here and bring up the registration again for you to have a look at. So this is the registration, and if I go to correct the record, it will open up the form and we can see the data that I entered into this form to try and explain what I mean. So here you can see that the place of delivery is set to a health institution, that is Ibombo Rural Health Centre. And if I go into the form, you can see that at no point did I have to enter the address of this health facility. That's all coming from the dynamic administrative structure data that we seeded in the database. But if I chose to enter residential address as a place of birth, then of course I can change these values. I can add in more rows I can even change the country and have, international, states, districts, etc. So all of these address properties match to fire properties. That's the fire standard. So even if in your country you would refer to the top level administrative area as a province, for example, or you might call it a division, in fire we still refer to that as a state. Doesn't matter how it renders for you, and we still refer to second level as a district. So the back end still uses state and district, no matter what you visually see. So just bear that in mind. But essentially, we're going to have a situation where when we want to render place of birth on a certificate, we're going to be choosing different properties that are possible to be there in terms of the handlebars for a birth that occurs in a health institution that you've seeded versus an entirely custom address. Be that a custom address in your own country or internationally. So for this reason, when the designer is designing the certificate, they're thinking about what are we going to render on the certificate. So here you can see the design. I'm just going to zoom into the design a bit so you can see. Apologies, it's a bit fuzzy when I zoom into this PNG file, but you can see where it says place of birth, the designer is saying if it's a district that we're aware of, then just type district. But if it's a hospital, then just type the hospital name and then the state. So the designer is telling me they want to have a conditional rendering here. Either we show hospital, state, country, or we show district, state, country. So how do we do a conditional in handlebars? So you do it like this. So let me zoom in to show you. So handlebars.js comes with a number of operators you can use. In this case, I'm writing an if-else statement. So you can see I open the handlebar with an if conditional, and I have an else, and I can close the if conditional. Now, it's important that you do this in the SVG inside a text element. That's where you can use the decide which kind of HTML element to render. If you do it outside of that, you might get some strange results. It might not necessarily render the way you expect, because the T spans here, that's what has the X and Y position of where to place the text. So you also need to know a little bit about historically how the place of birth and address locations work in the handlebars. So if I go to the handlebars reference, you can see on line 32, roughly around 32, you will see the place of birth handlebars. So you can see there are two handlebars, one called place of birth, one called place of birth facility. And in each case, these two properties will be equal to the name of a health facility if a health facility has been selected, or undefined. If a health facility has been selected, then we have functions which go to the fire location for the health facility and grab, using the health facility ID, and grab the country, district, state from that health facility location, and any other location level, extra level, which you may have entered. And if you've chosen a residential address, then the following handlebars are used all the way down to international addresses. So you have these place of birth prefixed handlebars for a health facility and administrative structure level prefixed handlebars for manually entered addresses. So in the birth certificate, you can see I'm using the place of birth facility in an if conditional. So I'm asking if this facility is undefined, i.e. the user has put in their own address, then use those manual address levels to render the district name, international district, etc. We have a helper function here called location, and that's built in to OpenCRVS. So yes, we were talking about helper functions before in the previous video. We used one called debug in order to log all of the available handlebars. Well, there are some helper functions which are already built into OpenCRVS, and one of them is location. And you can pass a fire ID to location, and you can get back two properties. One is the name, and the other is the alias. So we didn't use aliases when we were seeding locations, but I did mention that it's possible to have multilingual ways of representing a place name. And in some countries that might be a requirement, particularly if you use multiple character sets. For example, if you have want to display a location in English as well as in Arabic, or English as well as in Bengali, or something like that, then you'd want to use the alias property if the certificate was going to be displayed only in one of those languages. So that's why we have the location helper. And you can see that if district, this will get the name of the district, and if that didn't exist, i.e. the user had chosen an international address, then it would show the international district. So one of these will always be empty. So you can stack them up knowing that only one will render. So you can see, here we go, this is what I'm doing for a manual address. And then if the user has chosen a health facility, a hospital as the place of birth, then we will show the actual name of the hospital in full. And in our country, the name of the hospital contains the district that it's in. So it's like Ibombo District Hospital. So there's no need for us to put Ibombo District in. So we go straight to the state and then the country. But of course, this is up to you. It may be entirely different in your country, but this is how you can set up a conditional handlebar. Another use case for conditionals in my certificate is MOSIP integration. So if I look at my certificate further down, I have the MOSIP application ID on the certificate. And when we integrate with MOSIP in a future video, I will show how this works. But in our basic configuration, we don't need it. We're not integrated with MOSIP yet. So there's no point this displaying if it doesn't exist. So once again, I have another conditional here saying if the MOSIP AID is undefined, then show nothing. Otherwise, show the label MOSIP application ID. And I know that the actual ID, which is up here, will just be blank. It'll be empty if it doesn't exist. So I don't have to do anything about that. But here you can see I'm using an if conditional to control labels. So that's using an if conditional to control parts of the SVG which aren't even dynamic. You know, this label here. So let's have a look at these in practice. So I'm going to go back to I'm just going to exit this registration without making any changes. So previously I had shown you an individual who's born in a hospital, and let's take one more look at their certificate. You can see that it says, I'll just zoom in, Ibombo Rural Health Centre, and then the state and the country, and then I will choose a registration, this one here. And if I look at this registration, you can see that this individual place of birth was not a hospital, it was a residential address, and I just entered the first 3 lines, the country, the state and the district. And so let's take a look at that certificate. And now you can see that I'm only rendering the district, the state and the country as per the design. So that's me satisfied this requirement to show district or hospital name followed by state or country. So this is how you work with conditionals in handlebars. So the next step is to substitute these images. So I'm going to substitute the registrar signature and the QR code with the handlebars for images. And that's me then completed the certificate configuration. So I'll be back in a few minutes. So the next thing to show you is how to add images into the certificate in place of these placeholders that the designer has inserted for me. So this took a bit longer than I expected because, well, I'll show you why. So here you can see this is the certificate I've been given, and I want to replace these placeholders with this placeholder here with the registrar signature and this placeholder here with the QR code. So what you have to do is you have to find out the image tag in the SVG associated with this image and change it from the base 64 that you see here with the handlebar for the image. Okay, so in order to find the image tag, you have to right click and choose inspect. And you will see, if I just zoom in here, I'm inspecting this signature image, and if I can zoom into the code, you can see it says URL pattern 1. Okay, so that's the ID you have to remember. Pattern 1 is the signature. So I'll go back to the code, and this is the SVG, and I search for pattern 1. Let me just zoom in. Make it a bit easier for you to see. That's the same line, pattern 1. And if I keep following pattern 1 down, I can see here is the block where the image ID is image 011575003. And then if you copy that ID, you can see this is the image tag with the base 64 that we need to replace with the handlebar. However, if we go back and look at this tag, we can see the image, the same image, is being used in 2 different locations. It's also being used in pattern 0. So you can see that essentially it's the same as the QR code, which is pattern 0. So I think to save some time, the designer has just duplicated an image twice. But we can't work with that. We have to have an independent image tag for each image, because we've got to have the handlebars separate from each other. We can't share the same image tag. It's got to be another image tag. So I had to ask the designer to resupply the SVG using a different image source for each location. So that's one thing to bear in mind. You have to have different sources. So here is the replacement SVG. So you can see I've now got a fake signature where it should be, and I've got two different image sources to choose from. Wonderful. So you right click on the SVG, inspect, you find the ID for the signature. This time it's called pattern 1, and you go to the new file and you look for that pattern. And eventually you will find, so pattern 1, this is the new file, I found it. Let me just make this a bit bigger for you. Okay, pattern 1. And you can see I now have every image has a different ID. So that's better. I've got different tags for each one. So you can take a look at that image tag and you know that this is the image tag for the signature here. Now when I come to this conditional that I've put in one moment. But I've now got two different tags to work with. I've got a tag like this, image 0, which is the QR code. And you'll probably see something like this. You'll see lots of base 64 for the image that's come from the design tool. So we need to delete all of that base 64 and replace it with the handlebar. In this case it's QR code. So you can see we've got an href on the image. Rather than it being set to base 64, it's set to the handlebar. And that for the registrar signature, that's the handlebar for the registrar signature. So you can see all those handlebars are also listed here. There's the QR code. This one is the old way of doing it, and it says it's deprecated. Use registrar.signature instead. So this is the supported way, the new way. So in the release we'll be advising people to move from that to that. So there we have the images in place. So when I upload this into the management system of the management user interface as before, it won't work. Why? Well, because you need to make sure that your registrar has a signature loaded. So let's log out. And log in as the administrator. And go to the team setting. And here's a registrar, for example, that's been seeded. If you look at this registrar, you can see there's no signature there, so it'll be empty. So you have to upload a signature transparent PNG, which will then go into that location. So you can create transparent PNG signatures without either signing with paper and taking a photograph and using image editing tools to make it a nice contrast, and then making a transparent PNG that way. But there's also lots of online signature makers. I'm using a mouse, so it's not very pretty, but you can use a pen and draw a nice signature, like a Wacom or something like that, and download a nice transparent PNG. For example, this one. You can see I've made this PNG for this registrar and upload it. So let's go to the office I'm working in, which is Ibombo office. And the registrar is called Kennedy Mwini. And we can edit details, and I've uploaded the signature here. So he's got a signature now. So now his signature will appear on every birth certificate, death certificate, marriage certificate that he registers. So we'll log out. And I'll log in as Kennedy Weenie. And I'll search for the previous registration. Go to print it. And now we can see his signature is substituted and the real QR code is substituted. So you can print this off, you can scan that QR code, and it will take you to a URL where the certificate can be verified. So now the certificate is ready. But I want to show you one more thing, which is depending on your policies, you may have what we sometimes call registration drives, or situations where you want to print off a lot of signatures in advance and you want to add a wet signature to them at a later date when you're actually issuing it. Some countries work in that way. Some countries, when they print in advance, they don't mind if a digital signature is on there. There's various options to you, open to you. In our demonstration country, when we are printing and issuing, we have chosen to put a digital signature on there. When we're printing and passing it physically over to someone, we're working with digital signatures. It's just the way that we've set up our country. And when we're printing in advance, we're using this to demonstrate how a registration drive could operate, where you print all hundreds of certificates, but they're not authorized yet until you actually go somewhere and then distribute them and sign them all in a remote location. That's just one way that some countries may want to work. So when we're printing in advance, we don't want the signature to appear. Okay, so just like I was showing before, you can use handlebar conditionals if print in advance isn't true, then show the signature. So you can do that if you want. So that really brings to an end certificate configuration. Certainly think it's quite a flexible way to do this. There is always room for improvement, so if you think you'd like to suggest some other feature, maybe help us refactor, we always welcome pull requests, so please go for it. Thank you very much for your time. Bye.